Thank you very much. Just looking at our program, the next panel, Ed Glab, will speak on energy, so we'll have more discussion of this, and thank you very much, Alberto, for your presentation. We now turn to Mexico with Manuel.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I agree with Alberto. Economists and strategists are not good at predicting the future. We pretend we do know, but it's false. So, who was predicting that the prices of oil were going to be at the level they are today a year ago? You were. There are exceptions to the rule, but in general, we are not good at predicting the future. And I think that the price of oil will behave erratically, depending on demand coming basically from China and supply coming from OPEC, which is interested in keeping their market share rather than keeping prices high. So I've been talking about oil many years because Mexico's economy was highly petrolized back in the 1980s, as you remember. And 85% of Mexico's export revenues were coming from oil, and oil was going to be the lever that would put Mexico in the developed country category. But that happened not to be true, precisely because in 1982, the oil prices started notching down, and they collapsed to levels of $5 per barrel in 1985. So we're seeing a little bit of the same picture, and I'm not as optimistic as Alberto that prices will recover in 2016 because there are all these other issues. So that's one element that's clouding the outlook of the Mexican economy to some extent. 1/3 of the revenues of the Mexican government come from the oil industry, which is going through a major renovation and deep reforms, finally. But still, you are talking about 5% of GDP or 6% of GDP as government revenues. So the fact that the price of oil has fallen so sharply means that you have a fiscal hole that the government has to figure out how to fill. On the other hand, from an external point of view, the balance of payments point of view, there's no problem there. It turns out that Mexico today is a net importer of oil products. Mexico is exporting crude oil, and Mexico is importing large amounts of gasoline and gas. The net result is that the oil balance of payments, oil products balance of payments is in equilibrium or in a slight deficit. So from that point of view, the fall in the price of oil benefits Mexico because it provides cheaper raw materials. So this is a mixed picture, but this is something that puts the context in which we are dealing. The other major issue that we're facing is central banks' policies. Not the Bank of Mexico policy, which is has to be very much in tune with what the Fed does, but the general picture of monetary policy, because that affects directly expectations and interest rates. Agustín Carstens, who's our very powerful central bank governor, former student of mine, by the way, has been saying for quite a while that he wishes the Fed to go back to a normal monetary policy, to start raising interest rates. Because until it does, good news in the US economy, like employment generation, faster growth, etc., has a negative impact in countries like Mexico because the immediate reaction is, oh, they're going to start raising interest rates. So you, instead of having the normal connection of good news in the US are good news for Mexico because we are intertwined in this very tight cycle of correlation, particularly in the industrial sector in the US and the Mexican economy. It turns the opposite side because expectations are the Fed is going to start tightening. The sooner the Fed starts tightening, the sooner we are going to get to a normal relationship in that regard. So we foresee strong volatility in the next few months, thanks to external shocks. The Fed will start raising rates. I predict this month.
Yes.
But you never know. And that will help to sort of moderate the negative impact of future predictions of interest rate increases. Now, Mexico is growing at a slow rate, unfortunately. This year, it's going to be 2.3, 2.4%. It has picked up in the last month or two. Next year, the predictions range between 2.7 and 3.5%, depending on who you believe. And that has two elements. First, the recovery of the US economy, because as I mentioned, there's a close correlation between the US economy and Mexico's economy. And second, finally, the impact that the radical structural reforms that have been undertaken by this administration and a bit of the last administration keep on generating investment and faster growth. We are already seeing part of that. I don't know how many of you make regular phone calls to Mexico, but you might have noticed that it's much cheaper today to call Mexico than it was before these reforms. Finally, we have, the government has put a stop to Mr. Slim's monopoly, a reason why the price of his shares in the Mexican stock market and in the New York stock market has sort of been dampened, and his role as the richest man in the world also has been lost. So you have the energy reform, which is starting to get very good results. In what terms? Cheaper energy, cheaper electricity, and cheaper gasoline. We're starting to import large amounts of gas for industry in Mexico at cheaper prices. And the prices of products of the oil industry are in the process of being liberated, which means instead of paying 50% more of the price in Texas, which is the case today, 44%, you are going to pay the international price of oil products, which is essential if you are going to have a competitive industry. Now, when you have very expensive energy prices, what's the adjustment valve to remain competitive in the world's stage? Wages. So this will allow wages to go up to the extent that international oil prices or energy prices prevail. Now, the other thing that Alberto mentioned, and this is not exclusively a prerogative of Colombia, it happens all over Latin America, is that for many years, our mines have been linked to the exchange rate. The economies were dollarized. People thought in terms of the exchange rate and said, oh, the peso has devalued 20%, I demand a 20% increase in wages, and prices will go up tomorrow 20%. And this was happening exactly like that in the 80s, when the Mexican peso went from being 25 pesos per dollar to be 3,600, and we hit a rate of inflation of 160% in 1986. Today, the pass-through of depreciation to inflation has been broken. The peso has been devalued in nominal terms 30%, or has depreciated in nominal terms 30% with respect to the US dollar. The real exchange rate, once compared with the basket of currencies, not only the dollar, but other currencies, it has depreciated only 15%. But the fact is that today prices are stable. The rate of inflation is the lowest Mexico has had in 40 years, 2.7%. So that breakthrough was broken. Why? Because expectations, since the peso started floating effectively in 1995, and the Mexican government, the Mexican Central Bank gained its independence from the government in 1994, means that there is no longer what's happening in Argentina, in Venezuela, and in other countries. The automatic link of the central bank will print money to finance the government's deficit. In the mandate of the Mexico's central bank, autonomous central bank, is an explicit prohibition to the bank to lend to the government. The government cannot buy CETES, Mexican treasury bills, from the government. It's banned from doing that. The government couldn't do what the Fed has been doing in the last 5 years, which is bloat its balance sheet by buying bonds from the Treasury and other entities. Now, this means that the central bank has gained credibility, has followed a very well thought and careful and prudent monetary policy, and has anchored expectations. There has not yet been any pass-through, as I mentioned, with an additional element. All these lower prices in energy and telecommunications and so on have contributed to a lower rate of inflation. So in that regard, I think that the country is in good shape. The bad news is that we don't seem to be able to grow faster, but to the extent that the new reforms take hold and become generalized and have their ultimate effects, you will start seeing a much faster rate of growth. Meanwhile, if you look at figures of interest rates, the reference interest rate, the equivalent of your prime in Mexico is 3%. Compare that to Argentina, which we don't know what's a reference interest rate. Or Brazil, the Selic, I don't know, I haven't seen the Selic these days.
30-something%.
Okay, so 3% is the rate in Mexico, which means that credit is flowing, credit is growing, both for the public and the private sector. And we expect that aspect of, there has been also a very interesting financial sector reform, because years of mismanagement and high inflation back in the 80s meant that the degree of deepening of the financial sector was very shallow. The use of banks by the population was very shallow. This is in the process of being corrected, and that's something that should be a good news. Credit has been growing at 10% in the last year or two. Now, what about debt? A recurring issue in our countries, including the US, by the way, is debt.
Spades.
I think that if you want to explain most of the crisis, financial crisis that the world has gone through, you have to look at debt. And there is a proper use of debt, as Alberto mentioned, as a lever for development. And there is a very improper use of debt when you get too much of it, particularly in a different currency. Today, Mexico's debt, net external debt, is less than 30% of GDP. The total assets in foreign denominated assets and the total liabilities of both the public sector and the private sector only represent 30% of GDP. It's perfectly manageable. So in that regard, the domestic debt profile of the Mexican public sector and the foreign debt profile, you have to look at both the private and the public sector. Because if you don't, you end up in a problem like Spain did. Spain, the official debt, foreign debt of the Spanish government before the crisis was virtually zero. They were running fiscal surpluses, but the private sector was highly indebted. The crisis comes, hits the country, the private sector is unable to service its debt, the banks are in trouble, and the banks go to the government for help, and the government has to adopt all that debt. So you have to look at both private sector debt, public sector debt. In the case of Mexico, is quite manageable. So Mexico is in a different picture from the rest of our neighbors in Latin America. Mexico is not an exporter of raw materials for the most part. 85% of Mexico's exports are manufactures. And therefore, we're not subject to the terms of trade fallout that has affected so badly countries like Argentina, Brazil, etc. So I would say, all in all, the picture is moderately optimistic in relation to Mexico's future, and particularly, there is no crisis on the horizon. Thank you very much.